Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you are joining for the first time, this is part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have a very exciting panel for you that is willing to share their insights and wisdom. For today, we are going to be talking about a very specific topic that is cradle to grave. And if you have been in any ERP implementations, this is going to be a very religious discussion because obviously there is a very thin line between how manufacturing sees the assets versus how service sees the assets versus how the finance is going to see the assets. And there are always debates in terms of, what is a real asset, whether it is a physical asset or is it the internal, external software asset. So we are going to discuss all of that. So first, we are going to start with everybody's intros, and I am going to start with my intro. If you don't know me, I am Sam Gupta. I am principal at Elevate IQ. I have roughly 20 plus years of experience in leading the ERP and digital transformation engagements, and fixed asset is going to be near and dear to my heart because that is part of every ERP implementation. As part of Elevate IQ, we are an independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. Our focus is going to be on business process redesign, system procurement, system selection. It's going to be your business architecture, enterprise architecture, as well as the ERP implementations. On that note, I am going to move to Chris for his intro.
Thanks, Sam. I'm Chris Gherardini. I'm the president and owner of Turnkey Technologies. Turnkey is a 27 plus year Microsoft Dynamics ERP implementation partner. So asset management and from the cradle to grave is a huge part of the ERP process, as Sam has indicated. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. Tom, I am going to ask you to introduce yourself next.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. And hello, gang. Glad to be here with you. My name is Tom Rodden. I am an IT specialist. Leader in a number of different companies and consulting groups over the years. Most recently was CIO at Varian Medical Systems. Currently doing consulting on a big ERP program at Seagate Technology. And a lot of years of working with various types of assets. So I'm actually quite interested, Sam, in discussing the definition of asset as we get into this too. So thanks.
Amazing. And I'm super excited to dig into that as well. Thank you so much for being here, Tom. Dave, I am going to ask you to introduce yourself next. Can you hear us?
My name is
Dave, we are really struggling with the bandwidth.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna try. Andy, do you? Andy, do you want to go next?
Sure, Sam. My name's Andy Pratico. I've been involved with ERP software, specifically for manufacturers and service organizations. So over the last 4 decades, I've worked with companies all over the US and all over Canada. And I actually teach companies how to evaluate ERP software. I have a published book on Amazon on the topic. So thank you, Sam.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Andy. David, you are joining for the first time. Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on. Very excited for my first panel here. My name is David Dozer. I'm the president and owner of Blaze IT. We're a reseller specializing in cloud solutions for manufacturers. I've been involved in the ERP world for about 20 years, give or take now. Very focused on the manufacturing side, but have a lot of financial background as well. So really excited for this panel and marrying up the, business and manufacturing side to the finance side, and discussing and arguing about who cares about what. So again, excited to be here and appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
And I am super excited to be learning from you as well. Thank you so much for being here, David. And I can see that Dave actually is trying to join again. Let's see if we can connect with Dave. Dave, are you able to connect now? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sam. No,
No, it's really not working, Dave.
no.
I don't know if you are speaking right now.
Yeah, I can hear you guys. Can't hear you. Why don't you please continue?
Okay, thank you so much, Dave. I'm actually gonna move with the first question today. So I am going to start with Chris. But before we start with the question, if you are joining in the audience and if you have any questions or comments, make sure you guys comment those, because we are going to be covering those as part of the show. And if we cannot get to those, our panelists are going to be in touch with you, and they will, provide the insights for your comment or the questions. So the first question is going to be similar to what we have done in the other panel, Chris, and that's going to be really, what is the scope of the process? And I think there's going to be a, debate around what is the scope of the cradle-to-grave process, and which are going to be the assets that really qualify as the asset as part of the fixed asset process, whether these are going to be internal versus external. So do you want to describe the number one, the end-to-end process, and then user journeys, how many touch points we have in the process, and what is going to be the scope of each of the touch points?
Sure. Appreciate it, Sam. And I think as you started that, the different types of assets, and again, whether we're tracking fixed assets or different types of assets that might be tooling or software licensing, we have a lot of assets that a lot of times they show up in the building and everybody books them and we forget about them or we lose them. So as we think about those best practices and business processes to govern over, I always like to start with the procurement side, meaning how did we initiate the request? And is it begin with a requisition? And again, not all organizations are going to have that formality. And maybe I wrote something, I sent an email, but it's a requisition. I need a new laptop, or I need a new tool, or I need a new toolkit. But anyway, it starts the process. It's a requisition and the determination of the class of asset, if it is an asset, and then certainly to procurement, out the door to the PO, receives it a doc, and immediately when that piece of equipment, small, large, whatever it is, shows up, there's a tracking and a traceability requirement that should kind of follow it. And again, where's it go? Again, normally we receive it vouchers, it goes through accounts payable and it's invoiced, but that doesn't automatically have whatever this thing is I bought go into a system to really track it. If it's an asset and it meets that threshold of $1,000 or whatever it is, sure, you put it in there just for purposes of depreciation. But there's so much more if you think about that business process, meaning where does it belong? Is it something that has to be serviceable? Does it need to go into my asset management system? Different than fixed assets, which means I'm putting it into an asset management system, and not all ERPs have those. So maybe that's a separate system, but it could be integrated where I know who I bought it from. I know what the cost was. It goes in this asset management system. And now I'm trying to define, well, what's the serviceability? Is it a preventative maintenance schedule? Is it something I can do? Do I have to have a vendor? Oh, great. Now there's another contract linked to a PO for service. So you feel the complexity growing. Maybe it's tooling. Maybe it's something so small that, great, it went into AP. Well, where's it at? How do I track it? It doesn't fit in fixed assets. Where's that go? And I'll let the manufacturing guys talk about that. But that's an example of just the front end part of the process. But then even, servicing it, we talked about that. But what about that cost? Where's that cost go? Does it just hit depreciation? Well, maybe I use it in manufacturing. So now there's a part of that process where I have to make sure that I figured out how to consume some of that cost on manufacturing, generate a contra interest, so I'm not hitting depreciation, but that cost of that asset, part of it goes through manufacturing into WIP, into finished goods, and then it ends up cost of goods. Different flow. Okay. So as you think about costing and cost allocation, another part of that asset management backside, hey, I can't service it anymore. Analytics, analyzing. So you need some business intelligence that tells you, stop putting money in that asset, throw it away and buy a new one. So again, now we're back to BI and now we're talking about disposals. I'll stop there. There's a lot of process in there. And again, by industry, different processes, different formalities. So I'll stop there.
Okay, amazing stage there. And I think I love the details that you provided. And one of the key comment that you made is going to be, okay, what is the start of the asset? And you mentioned that it typically starts in the procurement. Now, we are going to have a little debate there, okay, on that comment, because there are going to be internal and external assets. And, and the external assets are going to be serviced as well. So I don't know where you draw the boundary, but the clarifying question I'm going to have for you, because see, Tom is actually going to cover the internal versus external, and if the manufactured assets, meaning you are manufacturing, could they have financial value, and can you carry them as the fixed asset as part of your books or not? So I think we are going to discuss all of that. But before that, my question to you is going to be, you mentioned the CMMS system, which is going to be slightly more manufacturing focused system. Obviously, they have very different workflow from the asset maintenance perspective, you have the financial system, and the way you were talking, it seems like there is a very close collaboration between these two systems, meaning you need to exchange a lot of data for them to be able to work. And that mapping could be a significant task. So in your experience, have you seen a dedicated CMMS system being used? And for the financial, you have the ERP, obviously. I am going to assume that that's probably going to be your fixed asset module. But then for your CMMS, there is a separate system. Have you seen this working in your projects, and what was the nature of the project?
Yeah, and I've seen both, and I'm lucky that Microsoft built in an asset management into the Hero product, so it's right there, it's connected. We don't have to go get a third party, but not all ERPs have a full blown out asset management system. So typically, it's a standalone system. And what are they doing? They're putting the data here, and then I got to go configure it all here. And so there's a lot of integration that could exist between, because again, if I'm not servicing it, I got POs, I got AP, so we've got accounting loops between asset management, and it just adds complexity. Certainly, ideally, if you can find an integrated system that you don't have to come in and build that integration, that certainly is the best scenario for you. You really don't want to buy a standalone application, in my opinion. So, and the other point I will make is, you're right. We have different types of assets. We could take a project and build an asset through a project. That's an internal. That may be a company asset. Could be I'm building a building. Your point was I'm building and manufacturing equipment I sell to a customer. Now I want to put them into an asset management system and manage and sell them preventative maintenance. And you're right. So there's a lot more complexity on that path as well.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. So Tom is super excited about this topic. And Tom, the question is going to be similar, overall workflow, the touch point, the journeys, the scope. What is the definition of asset, when we talk about the fixed asset and cradle-to-grave process?
Well, first, I agree with pretty much everything Chris said. It was a very good outline, I think, of many types of assets, that covered. I think IT assets could be covered in many ways by what Chris described as the process. I think manufacturing assets, be they machines, be they tools, could also be covered with the description that Chris gave. I applaud that. There were two other types of assets, I guess, that were on my mind. I had a list of 5 or 6, and Chris covered IT assets, manufacturing assets, tools, and facilities. But there were 2 others that were on my mind. One was equipment that we sell, to your point, Sam, and the other was people assets. This may be some dangerous turf. I'm not sure people like to be thought of as assets, generally speaking, but what I mean by those two is, first, in businesses that I've been a part of, where we're selling major pieces of equipment, multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment in some cases, there is a life cycle there that it's critically important to monitor and manage. And in some cases, the equipment was so big and heavy and complex that we would have a version of the equipment master, if you will, the asset master for the equipment we sold, that was as built in the factory. Then it had to be disassembled because it couldn't be shipped as a single unit. It had to be shipped in parts. So it had to be disassembled and shipped to the customer site where it was rebuilt. So then there was an as installed, because inevitably something might get lost along the way. There might be a replacement component, a lot of serialized parts. And so we were now saying, well, the as installed was a little different than the as built. And then there would be the as maintained. So as Chris was saying quite rightly, there's service out in the field. And now we're upgrading the software, we're replacing parts, and we want to maintain that record of the asset. And that will be not just because it's nice to know. It's because next opportunity we get to sell an upgrade to the customer, we really want to know exactly what they have. Would this customer be a candidate for this upgrade, for this new piece of equipment that we feel could be part of the environment that they have and are building out? So I think there's a lot of equipment management from that sales point of view, sales and service point of view, that is separate from the procurement cycle and that whole life cycle that Chris described. And then I think there's a people piece, which again, different businesses may handle this differently, but certainly where I've been in healthcare and where there's been FDA regulation, people are not only managing when a product is being built, and the FDA is not only asking, is the equipment that you're manufacturing on current and latest versions of software and hardware? Are the tools calibrated and current in terms of the spec that they should be operating under? But are the people certified to be using those tools and to be running that equipment? That is another part of the asset portfolio, if you will, that the companies that I've been a part of are expected to be able to share when the FDA might come in for an inspection. Do we have the certificates handy? Can we demonstrate that for this person working at this machine using these tools, manufacturing this piece of equipment? So all of that, I think, is also potentially what you could consider asset management in a sense. So anyway, I'll stop there, Sam, but I totally agree with everything Chris said, and I just wanted to add a few things.
So we are going to have a very interesting discussion, and obviously I am going to be making some comments, and you guys, feel free to challenge me, as much as you like. So here, the way I always perceived the asset word, and obviously there is a lot of confusion in terms of what a fixed asset is and how that needs to be represented. So as you said, Tom, that there are many different assets, and some of these assets are going to be the ones that are being serviced. Some of these assets are going to be the internal assets that are really collaborating with your manufacturing processes. But the way I like to think from the finance perspective, also from the ERP perspective, it was always in my mind that, okay, whose asset are we talking about? So Chris made a point that procurement, whose asset are we talking about? Meaning, is it my asset that has the financial value that I am carrying as part of my fixed asset model? That's the asset for the ERP. If it is somebody else's asset, that typically goes in some other processes inside the ERP system. You guys can correct me if I'm off here, but I have seen a lot of confusion in the community. They seem to think that, even if the asset is going to be used as part of the manufacturing process, if it does not have the financial value, sometimes they call it asset equipment, but that's not really an asset as such from the ERP perspective, because a fixed asset must have the financial value for the organization, because that value is going to be carried on your books and that you have to depreciate, as Chris had mentioned. So Tom, I don't know if you're going to have any follow-up comments there.
Well, again, it's down to definitions. If you're talking about asset management more generally, I would say that those items that you consider to be off the books are as important, and many people would say more important than even the assets that are on the books. It is the business. It is the customer-focused aspect of asset management. I want to know what my customers have. Frankly, not only what we've sold them, but maybe the competitive products that are installed and our opportunities for us to ultimately replace, or at least we have to interoperate. And that is the business. But if we're talking about fixed assets that are on our books, you're absolutely right, Sam. Then all of that install base information, as we typically refer to it, those assets are not the classic fixed assets. So I don't disagree with you on the definitions.
Okay, amazing. And we are going to check this with everyone, what their definition is, because this is always a very interesting discussion in the community. So seems like Dave is back, and he is looking very good right now. So I am going to, and he is going to have a lot of points from the manufacturing perspective, and that's why I really wanted to have him on the show. So Dave, I know you could not introduce the other time. Do you want to introduce right now and then start with the question, what fixed asset is in your and what is the scope of the fixed asset management when you think of that?
Absolutely. Can you hear me now, Sam?
Yes.
Oh, Okay, perfect. Hey everyone, my name is Dave Griffith. The short version is called Kaplan Solutions. I've been in manufacturing mostly on the OT side for most of the last 15 years. And I, in the last 3 or 4 years, have focused on helping companies go through digital transformations that pay for themselves, which is what I call sensible digital transformation. So I would say similar to the great comments that Chris and Tom had is when I generally think about fixed assets, I generally think of kind of the mostly the machinery, right? So the machinery, the physical objects on the plant floor. We of course have fixed assets such as software and otherwise, but typically when I look on the OT on the manufacturing floor, I think of mostly fixed assets as the things that I can touch and feel, the lines, the parts of the lines, everything that goes in between. And then we kind of expand beyond that towards, we can call it like the IT side, a lot of the software, be it the ERPs or the MESs or everything else, the physical servers. But mostly from the OT side, from the manufacturing side, I generally consider fixed assets as things that I can, see, touch, and feel.
Okay, amazing description there of the fixed asset. So from your perspective, I think I'm actually going to bring back the question that was about the CMMS, the workflow of the CMMS versus the ERP. So in your experience, when you see these two different systems, what is the scope of these two systems in terms of the processes? What are the processes that are hosted inside your CMMS system versus what are hosted inside ERP if you are using both of them in conjunction?
Absolutely. So I think Chris made a really good point towards the beginning. I think his point was something to the effect of if an ERP has a CMMS, it makes sense to go ahead and use the CMMS inside of the ERP. I would say that most companies that I've seen who have an all-inclusive system generally try to use less software pieces. And if you can add a module, it's typically easier to add a module than to buy another piece of software. When we talk about companies that I see using standalone CMMSs, it is mostly companies who have not gotten to the point of saying, hey, let me buy an ERP. So mostly when I see a CMMS, we've got the mostly OT assets on there. So mostly the fixed physical assets. We've got the preventative maintenance to the points earlier. We know what our schedules look like. And if we have to pull in outside vendors, we know what we have to do internally. Again, the preventative maintenance. Sometimes we get to predictive maintenance where we're measuring vibration and heat and other things on the factory floor itself. And we've got a good idea if we will need to go through the process of replacing a blower motor or a bearing or something along those lines so that we can replace it quickly and we don't have the line down for an extended period of time. So in my experience, kind of the major differentiator is that smaller companies are using CMMSs that maybe have not gotten to the point of stepping up into a full-blown ERP.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Dave, for that. So I'm actually going to come to Andy. Andy, the question is going to be similar as everybody is addressing, which is going to be the scope of the cradle-to-grave process. What is the definition of fixed asset in your books? And what is going to be the boundaries of the process? How many roles are going to be touching the process? And what is going to be their journeys through the process?
Well, Chris, Tom, and Dave have already pretty much gone A to Z or A to Z, depending on your Canada or United States, on the whole topic of fixed assets. Whether we're talking about machines out in the shop or that computer desktop in the office or the software they're using, these are all different types of fixed assets. Tom mentioned people. No question about it. For a lot of companies, that is an asset. But one step further that wasn't discussed, and I'll throw it out there, is IP, intellectual property, because that could be an asset of the companies or it could be an asset of the employees. And there's always a debate and a back and forth of who owns what in those regards. But IP can be sometimes the most valuable asset the company has.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Andy. So one question that I am going to have for you, and you are absolutely right that people are obviously going to be the asset as well, and the IP is an asset, and that actually has a lot of financial value. Typically, I think that would be carried as goodwill, and you guys can correct me if I'm off here, but typically, if it is going to be a intangible asset, then that is probably going to be carried as goodwill, which is going to be depreciated over the period of time. But when you say people as asset, and obviously there's a lot of debate here overall, people being the asset. So from the sentiment and emotional value that people are asset of the organization, I get it. But do they actually have the financial value? Are they actually carried, on the balance sheet? Has anybody seen that scenario? So from the fixed asset perspective, typically fixed asset in the finance books is going to be that it has to have some sort of financial value. So have you guys seen people being carried as the financial value because they are going to be critical asset for the organization? Andy, have you seen that in your experience?
I'll be honest. I have never seen that as an empirical number on the financial statement. And value of people or IP or all these seems to be much more of a soft value that don't really get a measurement. Has anyone else had any experience?
They buy insurance policies for people. Key man in policies.
In some,
that,
you're right.
So that's
especially executives. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely, I guess time to change that. We probably need to carry that value as well, because definitely people are the assets. Thank you so much, Andy, for that. Okay, so David, I'm actually going to come to you. You are joining for the first time. So basically, the overarching question that we are trying to cover is, what is the scope of the Cradle-to-grave process? What is the definition of fixed asset in your box? What are different roles that are going to be involved? And obviously, in your industry, the assets are going to be far more complex. So maybe you might want to share the insights there.
Yeah, so obviously the rest of the guys, Chris and Dave and Tom and Andy have laid out a lot of the groundwork here. So I'll kind of build on some of that. With my experience, I tend to agree kind of with a lot of the things David said from the manufacturing standpoint. So really, if you're thinking fixed asset, it's very focused on, machinery, equipment. We have a big capital purchase, a large CNC machine or something that we're putting out on the floor. And kind of talking cradle to grave, though, one of the things I'd like to kind of point out is I feel like a lot of organizations, especially in that small to mid-size, very few of them really do a great job of carrying that through cradle to grave. Chris pointed out kind of what that life cycle looks like. And a lot of times I find what happens is organizations either are very focused on the financial side and the accounting side, and they're really great about getting that nailed down. And then kind of the CMMS side is sort of the Wild West, so to speak. You got guys running around putting out sometimes literal fires, as opposed to, going out and really doing that preventative type of maintenance. Or on the shop side and the manufacturing, they're really great. They've got the CMMS solution, and then the accounting folks are kind of haphazardly, throwing stuff on a spreadsheet and coming up with what those amortization and depreciation entries look like. So really the overarching thing to really look at is understanding organizationally what, like the guys have mentioned, what that definition of an asset is for your organization, but then also being really diligent about managing that from that requisition to purchase to getting it into service all the way through the financial side. And, like I said, I've kind of worked on both sides of the house there. So I can see a lot on the financial side too, where you do want to basically, if it has any sort of financial value, account for that. And one thing Chris mentioned too that I'd like to call out as well, that I think a lot of folks tend to brush under the rug is tooling. So you're thinking about things that are imperative to your manufacturing process, and so much of that just kind of thoughtlessly gets expensed, so to speak, and isn't always really getting accurately rolled in, to what your true cost of manufacturing is. And that's an area that, when you're talking fixed assets, really kind of gets forgotten a lot, at least in my experience. And, it's a lot of our jobs too, to kind of help folks bridge that gap between the financial side and the real CMMS manufacturing type of side there. If you can get it all in one solution, that's fantastic. And I found a lot of times people just are only focused on one side or the other. So it's really something to think about when looking at that subject.
Yeah, could not agree more. I think you are spot on overall. Your assessment with respect to your tooling, and then you said that some of the companies don't really maintain their entire life cycle of the fixed asset, inside the ERP or whatever systems that they might be using. And on that, I am probably going to have an interesting question for you. So obviously, there are two perspectives in the community that I typically see in the market. One is going to be if you are an SMB, fixed asset management is not really the operational process. Sometimes when you are trying to save money on your ERP license or on the implementation, it's probably wise to not implement the fixed asset because you probably don't need that, because first you need to be able to place your sales order and cut the invoices, because that's your bread and butter, right? But at the same time, when you look at the other side of it, right? So you are actually going to be increasing a lot of admin. And in some cases, what I have personally seen, for example, let's say if you are maintaining this on a spreadsheet, obviously you have to maintain the entire life cycle. Sometimes these companies could have 500 different delivery trucks, or 600 different, I don't know, man, I mean, so many different machines, and they could have life cycle. And typically in case of fixed asset, the regulations are changing all the time, and that needs to be captured as part of your accounting cycle. That increases a lot of workload for the finance department. So do you see this in your experience as well, that finance department is working a lot because they are not maintaining the fixed asset? What would you advise to these customers, whether they should be keeping inside ERP, not keeping inside ERP, when they are trying to cut corners on the ERP implementation?
I see the exact same thing, and I'm always a big proponent of if you've got a module that can do it, let's do it. There's no point in doing this outside of the system when you've got that in your ERP system. But frankly, in years of selling software and implementing software, probably 80% of small to mid-sized manufacturers are like, oh, we don't need fixed assets. We've got that taken care of. Sheila in accounting takes care of all that and just books the entries. But to that point, you're doing a huge amount of extra work to keep track of that and do that. And it's not because I think organizations don't care. It's sometimes they just, aren't totally up on what functionality is available, and even as you mentioned, changing regulations, it's getting harder and harder between just keeping track of what your actual booked value is versus some tax implications and things like that, and now you're talking about you've got to depreciate in 3 or 4 different methods, and you're doing that on spreadsheets, and you've got sometimes 2 or 3 people, and then your outside auditors coming in and looking at that as well. So it's one of those things. For some reason, fixed assets kind of always gets set to the side whenever you're talking about ERP implementations, and it's like, oh, we'll do that in phase 2. We'll do that later, and 8 years later, you've still never gone back and bought that module and worked to integrate it when it is really a key part of everyone's business.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, David, for those insights. So the next segment, I am going to open up and I am going to come back to Chris for his insights. And obviously, Chris, as you know, my favorite topic always is going to be architecture. And your favorite topic is architecture as well. When we think of fixed asset, okay, fixed asset is a very interesting beast, as David pointed out. Now, in case of fixed asset, when you are implementing an ERP, I don't know whether you have seen this or not. Typically, you have to go through a separate implementation for fixed asset, because it's just the implementation itself is just so involved. Each of the asset could potentially have its own books, because that's how complex the fixed asset could be. So obviously, you need to work a lot when you are implementing these fixed asset. Now, when you are trying to manage the life cycle of the fixed asset across the system, when you are using multiple systems in the architecture. So what I am really looking from you is the exciting stories that you have seen because of the misalignment in the system and because of the misalignment in the financial value, and losing on the preventive maintenance that you might be thinking of for those fixed assets. So any architectural stories?
Okay, I got a couple of them for you. So the one is a project we just did last year, and these guys, when we showed up, of course, they're doing 300 million in there, and they don't buy the assets, they lease it. We didn't talk about that caveat where now you don't own them. So they lease aircraft, train cars, and so but the process is, imagine that you're buying aircraft, trains, and and rail cars, and then but you're selling them and renting them back out to people. So the complexities of, we ended up bolting on a property management system to manage the leases. Then they got the fixed assets module, and then they needed a subscription billing. The problem is, they had a train wreck. Oh, we got to get rid of 10 cars. Well, you're over here working the lease with these guys, and you're retiring assets. I'll go, well, my billing schedule has to change. So the complexities between, again, the property, the lease management, the property management, the fixed assets, and even the billing in the scenario there, or maybe you're renting, right? And we got a rental module. So a lot of complexity and interactions. And I'm going to tell you, those systems they don't integrate. Meaning I retired an asset, train wreck, it doesn't update my billing schedule. So there's an example. And to your point, that was a concurrent, that was part of the core implementation. Now, another project we just now in these guys are 3 entities in about 250 locations, and fixed assets was not in the original scope because they said, we use a third-party system. I'm like, great, leave it over there until we finish the core. They're like, oh no, we got to do it right now. So they did actually bring that in, and there was probably 15,000 assets. So concurrently, but to your point, to land the assets, to get the life-to-date depreciation, the month-to-date, year-to-date depreciation, so that the first time it's in the system and you run it, that all the values are correct, all the depreciation's correct, it knows the right amounts, it knows how to hit all the posting accounts. There's a lot of cycles of validation that take place during that. But you're right, a lot of times, standalone system, leave it there. It doesn't have to be phase 1, to your point, but there's a lot of complexity and coordination. And then even, to your point, is if we're servicing those assets, getting all the preventative maintenance schedules, a lot of dates to make sure that everything pops when you first do it. So there's a lot of complexity in landing all of those data points, and making sure that it actually works correctly. So
Chris, I'm actually glad that you brought the point about the leasing, because I personally don't want to touch any projects that actually does the leasing, because that's a nightmare.
it's a
So for people who don't understand the difference between leased assets versus the other assets, what would you say to that? Because, typically, I think the biggest problem is going to be because of the changed regulations. And I think that would fall under, I don't know if that is going to go through the ASC 606, but there are a lot of things that are changing because of the leased asset. Right. And there are far bigger financial implication every time you have to track and you have to accommodate that as part of your process. So leased versus fixed.
And those applications that you're buying from the vendors, they're really, you need the software assurance, because they're the ones maintaining the compliance to the laws, to the tax laws. And so don't be confused. You drop your SA and my fixed asset module doesn't need updates. Yes, it does. It's just like AP and 1099s or W-2s. But fixed assets, to your point about revenue recognition and what you can take in terms of rules and stuff, there's just an amazing amount of complexity, especially in lease accounting. That's why we added a module. We're like, you don't customize something to do lease accounting. You find an application that was built for lease management that knows all the laws, all the rules, and again, is under an SA, so that you don't have to become that expert. It's just like using a sales tax subscription. I don't want to be that guy. So anyway.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights. So, Tom, I'm actually going to come to you for any architectural stories that you might have where you had multiple systems to manage the life cycle of the assets.
So I won't go into the primary use case that I was talking about earlier around sold equipment. Although I will point out, Sam, that the title of our webinar today is asset management, not fixed asset management. So that led me to think a little more broadly. But if we want to bring it down to things that are on our books, fixed assets really in that sense. One of the challenges being an IT leader in a number of different companies and contexts was always how we brought IT equipment onto premise and booked it. In a couple of places, we were using Dell as a supplier, for example, and in a global company with sites in different countries, while Dell would have maybe one contract with us for a standard set of models, different sites were delivering the equipment with different labels, different formats, serialized a little bit differently. And as we would bring it into our systems, it might come in first through SAP in terms of inventory management and get booked in. We would be saying, well, we want to include it in ServiceNow, because that's how IT really will manage these assets and monitor the process of, it's now 2 years or 3 years, it's time for a refresh. Who's due? Who's not due yet? how do we decide, how do we reach out and contact people and manage the reclaiming of that asset, maybe the return to the vendor and its replacement with the user. And how does that integrate as well with SAP's fixed asset module, where we really want to manage the value and depreciate it over time. And we would have, I wouldn't say fisticuffs, but we would have serious differences of opinion with the finance guy saying, we don't want to manage it down to the serialized item. You know, those are only $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 pieces of equipment, and we've got thousands of them all over the company. I don't want to deal with that level of detail managing it in my fixed asset management module. So we want to kind of deal with it in a bigger lump. And so how do we deal with the fixed asset management module, the inventory management module, ServiceNow, and coordinate all that at the appropriate level of detail so that everybody's happy? That was complex and challenging.
Yeah. So first of all, I think, you did a great job in bringing that perspective, because that perspective is extremely important, because that's how community feels, how they should be thinking about the fixed asset versus the other asset. This is a real confusion. And our goal from these panels is to bring the real life scenarios, because everybody is going to be thinking about these things differently, whether you talk about fixed asset or the asset management. So amazing point there that you actually brought it up. The question I am going to have for you is going to be overall in terms of the serialization topic that you touched. And obviously, I have seen that in my experience as well, that, serialization could be very involved when you are talking about those assets that are going to have $100 value. I don't know how many people really want to serialize assets that are going to have $100 value, because that actually increases a lot of effort from the finance perspective. So how have you handled this in your projects, or what have you seen when you have the conflict between your operations versus your finance? The operation probably requires the serialization, but finance does not care for that and they don't want it. So how have you seen this being handled?
Well, in this particular example, in most of the sites around the last company that I was a part of, we were receiving product into inventory, and in a fixed asset sense, it was being managed purely on an asset type and a value. So it was not in SAP on a serialized basis due to the relatively low value of those assets. And it was only in a detailed manner captured within ServiceNow. So the values needed to basically line up and the units needed to line up, but we weren't managing at the same level of detail in the different systems. And that did introduce complexity, but it was manageable.
Very interesting. So obviously, I am going to be asking other people as well if they have seen something similar or differently, but this is a very interesting scenario. Thank you so much, Tom, for that. So Dave, I'm actually going to come to you. Any architectural story that you have seen, misalignment between systems, if you have any thoughts around the serialization story, I think that's a great example, in my opinion, how the misalignment could be between departments and the systems.
Absolutely. I would say kind of my experience is I'm jealous of Tom and Chris because of the alignment. I kind of live in what we will just call the misalignment, right? So Tom brought up inventory. So in my experience, mostly on the manufacturing floor, we're talking more about inventory and less about assets. And when we talk about inventory, it's almost exclusively, we don't know what inventory we have, right? So all the way from the mom and pop, couple $100,000 a year, all the way to the Fortune 50, I get calls all the time that basically boil down to we think we have problems, but we don't really know what our inventory is. And because we don't really know what our inventory is, we can't really point fingers at one another. So I would say that there's typically a large misalignment. I appreciate especially Tom's point of, hey, we can serialize things, but under some value, it doesn't particularly make sense. I know a lot, or it doesn't make sense to kind of list out and depreciate item by item. A lot of the things that I typically run into, a lot of the things that we need are relatively those low dollar value numbers, and it doesn't make sense to serialize and then generally kind of push up to the IT folks, to the CFOs and the finance level to go ahead and to go through the process of depreciating line by line. So most of the time, I absolutely see more of a misalignment between things that we physically have on the floor and pushing up to some sort of fixed asset or asset inventory to be able to depreciate. And then what was the second question there, Sam?
The second question is just the story. So I think you already covered that. I'm probably going to have a follow-up question for you, related to the commentary that you made. And that is going to be, by the way, first of all, the misalignment comment that you made. I think misalignment is going to be key theme of any ERP implementations. That is always going to be there. The question I am going to have, I would like you to touch the inventory versus the fixed asset. Obviously, there is a lot of debate about these items being carried in the inventory. Sometimes they are carried as the fixed asset. So are fixed asset going to be the inventory items as well? Or the fixed assets are going to be utilizing the inventory? And some people might be confused about that. So do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Absolutely. I think you're just trying to get me like in trouble with every single CFO that I know and I talk to. So I thank you for setting me up with something that I'm absolutely going to whiff through. So generally speaking, kind of when we have those differentiators, that becomes above my pay grade. That becomes the person that deals, that understands everything that changes with GAAP accounting and all of that, and what goes in which direction. So I would say, generally speaking, when I think of inventory, I think of inventory that we're using to run through the line to make finished product versus the inventory of, hey, what are my spare parts? What spare machines do I have? Kind of what sits in that back corner or that maintenance shack, that those parts bins that I can go through and use. So I would typically not consider most of what I am calling inventory as part of a fixed asset. I would consider that more of a consumable for an end product as opposed to something that we're going to use internally.
Okay, amazing. And on that point, I guess, everybody's probably going to get in trouble with the CFO. Okay, so you are not alone. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much for those insights. Okay, Andy, I'm actually going to come to you. Any architectural stories that you have seen? And the key theme right now is obviously going to be misalignment, between the systems. When you have multiple systems, then you are going to have a lot of misalignments. So what misalignments have you seen in the architectural stories?
Well, I'm going to segue a little bit and leverage something that Chris had to say, which was some quote unquote ERPs have built-in asset management systems. Other ones bolt on asset management systems. And of course, when you're looking or evaluating these systems, the salesman's going to tell you that bolt-on works fantastic. The APIs are there, the integration's perfect and all that kind of thing. But the fact is, and Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong with your opinion. The fact is that when you have any type of a system where you're bolting things on that are third party developed by other companies, other software developers, whatever else, no matter how well you integrate them, they are not integrated. They are interfaced. There is never a replacement. And you talk about misalignment. My goodness, when you have two different systems that are trying to talk to each other, and this one's going this way and that one's going that way, misalignment is continuous. And so, of course, you have continual mistakes, errors, all those things you expect from having additional silos of information. But what I was going to say is that if the ERP has the fixed asset built in from the get-go, it's in its DNA. All the integration is already there. It already works together perfectly. It already updates your CMMS system, whether it's preventive or reactive maintenance. It already knows that you've got this machine on the shop floor. You've got this PC in the office. You've got, maybe it's the van out front that the service guy is driving to the customer site to do repairs. Whatever the asset is, it all is integrated. It's all one single entry of data. It's all updated simultaneously.
So great points there, by the way, Andy. And I'm going to have just one follow-up question for you. So obviously, when people use multiple systems, they use it for a reason. There are a lot of ERP systems that they are, sophisticated. There's no question about that. But at the same time, you are going to have demanding people like Dave. And then you are going to run out of the functionality for the manufacturing shop floor. And he is not simply being demanding, because manufacturing shop floor does need that functionality, that involved functionality, to be able to maintain these expensive assets, because what is going to happen is if you don't maintain them, your production floor is going to stop. So I know a lot of ERP systems can really support out-of-the-box functionality for those complex manufacturing workflows. But at the same time, I think there is going to be a point when they are going to run out of that, and then you probably would need the specialized system to be able to handle those scenarios. So have you seen any specific challenges when companies try to utilize these specialized systems? I know integration is never going to be smooth, but sometimes you need that.
I completely understand, Sam. And one of the chapters in my book is on this exact topic, regarding third-party bolt-ons versus integrated products. And you're right, depending upon which ERP you're evaluating, maybe that fixed asset module doesn't meet all your expectations. Maybe it only goes so far. And every software, no matter what it is, always has limitations. So it's up to you to evaluate, investigate, and understand what those limitations are, recognize whether or not that module is going to meet all your needs. And if it will not, then you're forced to go with the third-party add-ons or whatever the case and do your best with APIs to integrate the best you can. But you got to investigate what the product offers first built in, and hopefully it meets your needs.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Andy, for those insights. So, David, I'm actually going to come to you. So we are talking about the architectural stories. I don't know if you are going to have stories where you have had multiple systems, any misalignment, any challenges that you have seen in the Cradle-to-grave process.
Well, definitely sticking with the misalignment theme. I think I'll carry that torch onward with everybody, and kind of going back to some of the points that Dave made as well. I think him and I must kind of work in the same world, because one of the big areas of misalignment in manufacturing really is that differentiation between inventory and fixed assets. So in my world as well, when we use the word inventory, it's generally always strictly referring to raw materials or finished goods, and everything else kind of gets set to the side. And a lot of times, if you're talking about IT assets, things like that, they might even get taken right to an operational expense. And then the management of that comes down to, I've got a sticker sheet of asset tags, and the IT person slapping asset tags on this and has a Google Drive doc over here of who has what asset tags. So especially in manufacturing, that's a big spot for that sort of misalignment between what you're considering inventory versus an asset. And there's a lot of opportunity for things to get lost, to walk off, so to speak, and kind of grow legs, I guess, and find their way out of the building. And it is an opportunity, from an education standpoint as well, and to some of the other points that Chris and Andy and Tom had made as well. When you start talking about integrations, I'm going last here, so I'm just building on what everybody else has already said. There's an opportunity to say, okay, well, how far does my ERP take me from the asset management standpoint? From a financial standpoint, does it make sense to throw one line in there for $5,000 and here's all my IT equipment, or do we want to break that out by serial numbers and manage that? And then as it does get further, how far can we take it within the ERP? Do we need additional add-ons to manage that? Because again, I think in that manufacturing space, the big part of misalignment really comes from just you're so laser focused on making product, getting it out the door, that you kind of forget about some of these other frankly, very important financial things that are key to your business.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, David. So right now we are close to our time. So the only thing we can take right now is going to be the closing advice. Chris, what would be your closing advice for today?
Sure. And as you visualize, and I always start with this, visualize your asset process. Again, I think that even if you've got one system or multiple systems, and it's probably going to have a few different things, but make sure you chase it all the way through and you don't just worry about tracking the units and that, but make sure that the costing flows, right? If it's something that's used for production, and I was going to use the word mission critical, because there's stuff that's mission critical that you really need to keep an eye on. And that's going to really elevate the priorities on the systems that you put in place, meaning preventative maintenance on this asset that's used in manufacturing. It's revenue related. You can't miss that. You can't mess that up. Depreciation, it's costing. Again, your pricing has to be appropriate too. So there's a couple of components there of managing these things that can compromise your business. Just focus on those things.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. Tom, what would be your closing advice?
I only mentioned this in passing in my IT example, but I would maybe, as a bit of advice or insight, encourage people to distinguish between life cycle and depreciation cycles.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, particularly with IT assets, but I imagine it's true for any kind of asset. Those could be quite different. And in fact, while depreciation timetables and the assignment of an asset to a particular depreciation category or asset category that is associated with a depreciation cycle is not something that should be changed willy-nilly. That's a no-no. The life cycle of the asset, physically, genuinely, can be changed on a whim, such as when the CFO in our operation would say, yeah, we've had those laptops for 2 years, 3 years. We can keep them around for 5, right? I mean, we're kind of tight on money, so let's just make everybody use their assets a little longer. Well, so they're fully depreciated. We're not changing the depreciation cycle, but now the life cycle has changed. The refresh of that asset is going to be different. It really does have big financial implications because suddenly the depreciation falls off the books. And for 2 years, there's no more depreciation because we're not bringing in new assets. And so these things are quite different. And so just keep in mind how aligned or not aligned, to use that word again, your life cycle of the asset may be from depreciation tables and cycles.
Okay, could not agree more. Thank you so much, Tom, for that insight. Dave, what would be your closing advice, please?
Yeah, so I have 2 pieces of closing advice. One to Andy's previous point of integrated modules versus integration versus bolt-on. I would say that sometimes there's a third option of, do I choose and customize the thing that I have, or do I move to a third party? I would say in manufacturing, there's certainly a point in which you say, this is as good as I'm going to get. I have to change my process to fit what exists. It's quote unquote best practices for a variety of reasons. My other point is that when looking at this, I kind of generally tell everyone to take a step back, and to Tom's point, think of the longest something is going to live and the shortest something is going to live, and pick solutions and have plans, because things in manufacturing change. Sometimes machines break and you have to buy new ones. Sometimes your CFO decides that we need to use laptops twice as long as we had originally intended. So make sure to buy something flexible and make sure that your organization is flexible enough to go through what you're going to go through.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Dave. And Andy, we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be a little quicker on the closing advice.
Not a problem. I'm going to leverage something David Dozer mentioned a minute ago. It's always difficult to go after these 3 brilliant individuals because they've already covered everything possible. But very, very quickly, it's the same as when you're evaluating ERP software. Document what you expect the asset module to be able to accomplish, what's critical, unique to your company. Ensure, hopefully what you have, the ERP does it already, but recognize that the one that's built in is always going to be more integrated than the third party you purchase.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Andy, for that. David, what would be your closing advice, please?
I'll keep it brief, and it'll just be to find alignment between the functional areas: finance, manufacturing, IT, everybody get aligned, and everything else will fall into place.
Okay, amazing advice. So that's it for today, guys. If you joined for the first time, this was part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have a very exciting panel for you. So make sure you are not going to miss next week's show. We are going to be here. On that note, I want to thank everybody for their time and insights today.
Great job, guys.